public discourse is fixated on launch signatures and hypersonic trajectories. This is a calculated distraction. While strategic command tracks kinetic threats in the atmosphere, the decisive vector of attack is not fire and steel. It is absolute silence. The United States operates as a global leviathan, its kinetic power unmatched. Yet, this leviathan is entirely dependent on a nervous system of data flowing through undersea cables and satellite relays. The emerging doctrine of our adversaries is not to fight the beast, but to blind it, to sever its senses and leave it thrashing in the dark. This is the asymmetric response protocol. The US seizes a Russian or Chinese-linked tanker, projecting kinetic dominance. The counter-move is not a naval exchange. The kinetic cost is too high. Instead, the response is deniable and silent. CSIS reports confirm state-level investment in satellite blinding laser systems and deep-water submersibles designed for one purpose: severing cables. A blinded state cannot project power. It cannot coordinate its fleet, process financial transactions, or even maintain domestic grid stability. The solvency of the nation-state becomes the primary casualty. The seizure of a single physical asset triggers a systemic attack on the digital infrastructure that underpins the entire Western economy. This is not a theory. It is a blueprint for uncontrolled escalation. To understand the adversary's response, you must first understand their balance sheet. Every nation-state operates like a corporation. It requires solvency. The U.S. strategy of using kinetic dominance to seize assets, intercepting tankers as documented by Reuters and Sky News, is not just a naval blockade. It is a direct, systemic attack on the adversary's liquidity. This external pressure is engineered to trigger an internal solvency crisis. Analysts at RUSI have established that a protracted, unpopular conventional war becomes a terminal domestic liability. It drains state reserves and erodes political capital, forcing the leadership into a corner. When a state cannot afford the kinetic cost of a symmetric naval conflict, its survival depends on finding a different vector of attack. This weakness forces a pivot. It is not a choice. It is a mathematical certainty. The adversary cannot compete symmetrically. Therefore, they are compelled to shift the conflict to an asymmetric domain where the cost-to-damage ratio is inverted. They cannot build an aircraft carrier for billions, but they can deploy a cyber weapon for fractions of a penny on the dollar. This is the blueprint for their response protocol. The US seizes a tanker. They launch a deniable cyber attack against vulnerable infrastructure. We see this with China-linked groups intensifying attacks on Taiwan's grid. The kinetic seizure is the input. The asymmetric infrastructure attack is the calculated, low-cost, high-leverage output. This isn't escalation. It's an economic transaction, a launch-on-warning protocol for a state facing bankruptcy. The financial calculus of modern conflict has inverted. This is the core liability. According to analysts at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, the kinetic cost of a single main battle tank is approximately $5 million. The cost of a first-person view drone capable of neutralizing it is $500. This is not a simple price difference. It is a mathematical blueprint for systemic failure. This 10,000 to 1 cost disparity enables what strategists term the democratization of violence. The requirement for a nation-state to possess a multi-trillion-dollar industrial base to project lethal strategic power has been rendered obsolete. An adversary, state-sponsored or otherwise, can now achieve a disproportionate kinetic effect with minimal capital outlay. This economic reality is the accelerant. When the U.S. deploys high-cost naval assets to seize a tanker, as documented by Reuters, it forces an adversary into an asymmetric cost-benefit analysis. they cannot compete symmetrically. The logical protocol is to bypass the kinetic domain and apply leverage where the cost is low and the impact is systemic. Deniable cyber attacks against unguarded civilian infrastructure. Each seizure becomes a predictable trigger, activating a launch-on-warning posture in the cyber domain. The true kinetic cost is no longer the price of the asset deployed, but the solvency crisis triggered by the inevitable low-cost retaliation against our own critical systems. This is the economics of lethality. The decisive vector in modern economic warfare is not the open ocean. It is the trusted node. The theater of operations has shifted from contested straits to the critical infrastructure of ostensibly neutral or allied nations. These are the gray zones, the proxy laboratories where the protocols for systemic collapse are tested and staged with perfect deniability. The instability warnings you hear from regions like South Africa or even Canada are not the core problem. They are symptoms, the fever indicating the infection has taken hold. This is a blueprint for asymmetric leverage. An adversary state, unable to compete kinetically with U.S. naval dominance demonstrated by tanker seizures, will not engage in a symmetric, high-cost naval conflict. Instead, it shifts the battleground. According to CSIS analysis, actors leverage the open, interconnected networks of developed nations as staging points. Why risk a warship when you can achieve strategic objectives through a server farm in a Western-aligned nation with weaker cyber defenses? The kinetic cost is zero. The potential for paralysis is total. This is not theoretical. It is documented protocol. The intensified attacks by China-linked groups on Taiwan's critical infrastructure, as warned by their National Security Bureau, are the field test. Every time the U.S. seizes a vessel, be it a Russian Shadow Fleet tanker or one tied to sanctioned oil, it triggers a counter-move. China's accusation that the U.S. is the aggressor is not just rhetoric. It is the justification for the next phase of the asymmetric response. The gray zone is where these responses are refined before being aimed at primary targets. The systemic liability is that our own interconnectedness has been weaponized against us. The gray zone is the tripwire for uncontrolled escalation. RUSI reports indicate the next evolution moves from power grids to financial clearinghouses. An attack staged from a proxy nation that triggers a solvency crisis in the U.S. financial system, as hinted in forward-looking documents from institutions like the Bank Policy Institute, is the launch-on-warning scenario. The action-reaction cycle becomes terminal, where a miscalculation in the digital domain becomes the direct accelerant for a kinetic exchange. The launch-on-warning doctrine, a protocol detailed in CSIS assessments, is the ultimate systemic liability. The logic is simple. A nation launches its nuclear arsenal upon the first electronic signal of an incoming attack before its own kinetic capability is destroyed. The entire system is built on the absolute integrity of radar and satellite networks. Now vector in the asymmetric threat. A sophisticated cyber attack does not need to destroy a silo, it only needs to blind the radar. This is the fog of digital war. When the screens go black, the commander is forced into a zero-sum calculation. Is the signal loss a technical failure, or is it a deliberate blackout masking an inbound strike? To wait for confirmation is to risk the nation's solvency. To launch is to trigger a terminal exchange based on a digital ghost. The doctrine is no longer a deterrent. It is an accelerant for miscalculation. This action-reaction cycle is not random. It is a blueprint. The United States' use of kinetic dominance, seizing physical assets like oil tankers, is now a systemic liability. As confirmed by reports from Reuters and Sky News, each seizure of a Russian or Chinese-affiliated vessel is a trigger. It forces adversaries into a predictable, asymmetric response protocol. Unable to compete symmetrically at sea, state and non-state actors shift the conflict to a different vector: deniable cyber warfare. The blueprint for this response has already been field-tested. Taiwan's National Security Bureau warns that China-linked groups have intensified attacks on the island's critical infrastructure. This is not a test run. This is the established protocol. Therefore, the next phase is a mathematical certainty. CSIS modeling projects that the next high-profile kinetic seizure will be answered with an attribution impossible event against U.S. critical infrastructure. This is the calibration shot, designed to inflict maximum economic cost for minimum kinetic risk. Within the next 12 months, expect a multi-day, non-destructive shutdown of a primary U.S. LNG export terminal on the Gulf Coast. It will not be presented as an attack. It will be reported as a catastrophic, yet plausible failure of its industrial control systems.